What's going on, guys? It's Coach Bronson here. This video that you're about to watch is going to blow your mind. I want you to do me a favor. Before you continue the rest of this video, go grab a piece of paper, grab a pencil or a pen. I want you to take notes. You're going to have questions. Your mind is going to explode a little bit as you hear the things that Dr. Cywes has to say that are new. There's a lot of new information, a lot of things he's been working on that he's going to talk about in this video that I have to go watch. I've watched this video. I was in the interview and I had to go watch this video a couple times and take notes because there's a lot of new, really cool stuff about metabolism, how the body works, that I think you're really going to be interested in. In fact, after this video, in a week or two, I'm going to do another video where I kind of break down some of the things that he said because it's caused me to have to go do more research. So I'm going to go spend a couple weeks and learn how to learn more information about some of this stuff. I'd love for you to comment on this video with any questions that come out of you watching it so that it can give me some things I can help answer your questions based on the information that Dr. Cywes shares. So be prepared for a little ride. It's going to be fun. This is the joy of being willing to learn and grow and expand our knowledge. I think you're going to have fun with this video. All right, everybody, this is Coach Bronson here, and today we have the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Robert Cywes. He is the carb addiction doc, and we're going to go into some really good stuff about carbs, about addiction, and how to break free of the hold that they have on you. Thank you very much for being on here, Dr. Cywes.
Hey, Bronson, thank you very much for having me. You know, it's been a long time coming. I promised you this, I think, in March, and just because of the pressures on both of us, we've circled back, and it's now middle of October and we're finally here, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. What have you been up to? Like, you were in Africa, you were doing all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, the benefit for me is that we get to travel a lot. So one of the things that we've just done, and it's the secret is kind of now out, a guy by the name of Tim Noakes that you may have heard of, one of the gods of exercise physiology, and actually my first professor of physiology in 1981, 82.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
His first class was my first physiology class. I've known Tim since I was a puppy in medical school. But we've just written 62 authors. I was honored to be able to write 3 chapters to the first textbook with a topic of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, which is really about the physiology, the pathophysiology of carbohydrates and of how the body responds to chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption. Every disease out there. I mean, I wrote the one on body weight, I wrote the chapter on autism spectrum disorder, and I wrote the chapter on liver dysfunction, because that's kind of my background.
Wow.
It's coming out in March of next year, but this is going to be a revolutionary textbook, because now for the first time, 62 authors from all over the world presenting this data and a ton of exercise stuff. So there's going to be a huge amount on exercise physiology. Obviously, Tim Noakes is part of that, but Jeff Volek, all these guys that are exercise, phenoms, talking about their insights. And we can share some of that tonight, but it is going to be a revolutionary textbook.
Oh my goodness. So you're saying
looking forward to that.
I need to go back to school is what you're saying. I need to...
It is a lot to go back to school, but what we've done, the beauty about it is we've written it for lay people, but every bit of science is justified and backed up by our work in the clinical space, evidence and all that kind of thing. And what happened with Tim Noakes when he underwent a trial being accused of malpractice and all that kind of nonsense, he basically sat down and he said, okay, let's do this. You bring your evidence and I'll bring mine, because you're right or I'm right. One of us is right, one of us is wrong.
Right.
And let's go toe to toe with the evidence. And he had this mountain of evidence that supported his position. They came with anecdotes, accusations, and personal insults, because there is no evidence to support something that is just plain wrong. So he just destroyed that twice. And out of the flames of that, he was able to begin to talk to people that assisted him with that trial. And that's where this book has come about a decade after all of that. So it's a huge, big deal. And no matter where you are, if you're a fat guy, if you're a diabetic, if you're an athlete, if you are trying to break a world record in whatever it may be, this will apply to you, and the insights will take you that little bit better, give you greater insights beyond calories in, calories out.
All right. And I'm assuming that when that actually gets published, you'll put it on your social media. You'll let everybody know so we
Absolutely.
can get it.
Date for release is in March of next year. And we've now been given permission to talk about it. It's been 3 years in the writing.
Wow.
And
Okay.
I can tell you it's heavily referenced. I mean, I spent months just looking up and verifying all my references and that kind of thing. Very scientific, very valid. And so March of next year, but we're starting to do a bit of a talking circuit. On the 17th of November, for example, I've got my slot with Tim, and we're going to break down some of the sports psychology and sports physiology related to, and we can talk a little bit about that now, some of the new insights into all of that.
Okay, fantastic. Wow, that's crazy. So, okay, so you talked a little bit about your experience. You had some classes with Dr. Noakes as your professor. What is your background, and where are you coming from in your context and perspective coming into this space, helping people with carb addiction, with, changing their body, things like that? And then what actually got you, did you start with being low carb or being trying to get people to take carbs out?
The opposite. I started out becoming a fat guy.
Okay.
So what's interesting, I think this applies to so many athletes.
Yeah.
I played a game, not at a high level, but I am still very passionate about a game that is played, the best game on the face of the earth, played with an oblong ball. You take football, you add skill, you've got rugby. And so I played rugby for 32 years of my life.
Wow. Okay.
And it was my life. I was in medical school, but my friends, my sport, it was my life.
Yep.
And suddenly I hung up my cleats. And for anybody that's quit a sport, particularly a team sport, you don't realize how much your life, and particularly your emotion management, revolved around it. And as an athlete, especially a contact sport athlete, size matters. You want to be big, you want to be strong. So you've spent all this time bulking up. And in the 70s, 80s, 90s through 2000s, the way we did that was pig out on carbohydrates. And because we were young, our body was resilient to tolerate that. So we were great. And then, boom, I hung up my cleats. And in the ensuing year, I gained 100 pounds. Wow. And part of it was our, University of Michigan, I have free access to Wendy's that is within the hospital. Okay. So a 64-ounce Dr. Pepper, no ice, back and forth 10 times a day, free Wendy's triple burgers with extra fries. I mean, it was so easy and obvious to understand. The backstory to me is I always had carbohydrates as a wonderful emotion management resource in my life. Mm-hmm. But I also had my rugby, I had my friends, I had, the pubs we'd go to on a Saturday night, that kind of thing. And when that was taken away, what was left was my relationship with crystal meth, with sugar and starch.
Yeah.
And you don't realize how depressed you get as an athlete or someone who believes they're athletic. And that was my world when that suddenly gets taken away.
Yeah.
And I realized I really had an empty emotion management toolkit. I had carbohydrates and rugby. You took out the rugby, I had carbohydrates. Yeah. Not a very good place to lean on. Very effective for instant emotional gratification, but not that long-term effective. And then the second part is I ended up in a laboratory in Toronto where I did my Ph.D. and my general surgery. And my Ph.D. was in liver physiology, because in those days, in the late 80s, early 90s, we believed sugar was necessary for athletic performance. We believed sugar was necessary for the brain and for the health. So we were pumping sugar into these patients, and we found, oops, the more sugar we put in, the more disease they got. And we had to turn our hypothesis upside down and realize that, yes, sugar has value to a certain extent, but anytime you cross a threshold, it is an enormous liability. And more it pointed us to so many of the metabolic diseases. In 1990, I was able to reproduce diabetes in an animal model. We infused sugar into the blood vessels and saw the blood vessels just become inflamed and destroy themselves. And that really is diabetes. So out of a personal understanding of what was happening with me and my work in the laboratory, which turned the prevailing thought process of nutrition upside down, that's where I started to engage. And as a clinical surgeon, we were operating on a lot of fat kids, taking their gallbladders out, but not able to help them with their obesity. Yeah. So that's where I came from.
It's something you just said about the inducing diabetes in mice or rats. The blood vessels inflamed when you put sugar. So that would lead me to believe that sugar, carbohydrates, are somewhat toxic, inflammatory.
It's a concentration-based thing. So
Okay.
sugar is, and I think, okay, let's step back and I'll go a little bit scientific on you, but this is such an important concept to understand, whether you are a performance athlete looking to do better or just Joe Blow out there sitting on the bench watching Netflix. The way this works is that when you eat sugar or starch, and the key thing, Bronson, is it doesn't matter how that goes in your mouth. It doesn't matter if it's an apple, a donut, pasta, or ice cream. The intestine has this enzymatic pathway where it breaks all of that down into 3 simple sugars: glucose, galactose, and fructose. And that's what enters the bloodstream. And as it enters the bloodstream, hormones get released from the intestine, and then those hormones trigger the release of insulin. And insulin's job in the liver is to allow the liver to suck that sugar up, store some of it as glycogen, and then distribute some of it to the rest of the tissues, where it gets taken up in the muscles. You replenish your muscle glycogen. Some of it goes to the fat cells, where it turns into fat, all under the quarterback care of a hormone called insulin. Now, but under that condition, the liver regulates your blood sugar. So even after a meal, your blood sugar shouldn't go up tremendously.
Right.
A little bit up to trigger insulin, but not a huge amount. And the liver has a huge capacity for handling that. At the same time, the liver also handles all the protein that we eat. So I don't care if you're eating collagen, if you're eating a steak, or if you're eating beans, that protein becomes amino acids, and the liver takes that up and transforms it to other proteins with a threshold. And that's important for athletes because there's a certain amount of capacity. When you eat more protein, the rest has to be turned to sugar because there is no storage capacity for protein. So all these athletes that are chowing down tons of protein and drinking their protein shakes, if you're doing it all in a bolus, once the liver exceeds that threshold, it's becoming sugar. And insulin is then used to clear that. And that's one of the myths of athleticism, that more is always better. It's better to eat your protein multiple times a day than all as a one big bolus. But we can get back to that.
Okay.
Behind that, okay?
Yeah.
However, what happens is that excess sugar that you're consuming spills over in the systemic bloodstream, and the liver can't handle it all. So now your peripheral blood sugar, which is on the other side, so it goes intestine to liver, then to body. So now we're talking on the other side of the liver, your blood sugar starts to go up. So at first, the cells are taking all that up. But remember what you said and what I said is that excess sugar, excess glucose is toxic at a concentration level in any space, in the gut, in the bloodstream, and in the cells. So when you start to flood your cells with sugar, now those cells are starting to get damaged. They're full of energy. They're starting to get damaged. They're maxed out. And the only protection the cells have is to block the insulin receptor, because insulin, especially in the muscle cells, the insulin is responsible for getting that sugar into the cells. So when that receptor gets blocked, now you can't get more sugar into the cells. And now we deal with 2 different types of people genetically. One group of people cannot produce a lot of insulin. So when their cells become insulin resistant, and that's the holy grail, if there's one word you want to take away from this, it's the word of insulin resistance. So when those cells become resistant and they block that insulin, your pancreas, I can't produce more insulin. So the cells, interestingly, start to run at a sugar deficit, but the blood sugar starts to rise up. And those people are hyperglycemic, and that elevated concentration of sugar causes inflammation of the blood vascular space, whether it's in the liver, whether it's in the heart, whether it's in the brain, whether it's in the muscles. And those people suffer the diseases of hyperglycemia, high sugar levels, low insulin, high sugar. And those are the folks that are going to suffer heart attacks, strokes. They're suffering the diseases of vascular inflammation. Muscles don't work so well. Your ligaments and your tendons become flooded with sugar, so you get all stiff, and your stiffness doesn't get better. You lose range of motion. You ask any type 1 diabetic, a lot of them can't even comb their hair. So you get lucky there, but they can't even comb their hair because their shoulder is so stiff because sugar has attached to the tendons. And if you look at your athletes, that's problematic. And that's why when you cut the sugar out, a lot of that inflammation of your muscles and your tendons and your ligaments gets better very quickly. However, the second group of people genetically can produce a huge amount of sugar. So when their cells say, we're closing the front door here, we're blocking this receptor, the pancreas says, no, here's more insulin. And it overrides that mechanism, and it shoves extra sugar into the cells. So those people then in the liver and the fat cells can turn that sugar into fat. They become enormous. They gain weight very easily. Their blood sugars are relatively normal. So they've got relative normoglycemia. They don't have diabetes, but they got hyperinsulinemia. And the diseases that they get is obesity, massive obesity, but they also suffer from autoimmune disease. Their cancer risk goes through the roof, and Alzheimer's dementia becomes a huge feature of those people.
So
you've got two separate groups.
And it's all because of excess carbs, excess sugar.
It's all because of how the body handles excess carbs and where they do damage, which space they do damage. So it's interesting in athletes, for some athletes, the vascular effect and the ligamentous effect is more the problem. Stiffness, soreness, tender joints, those guys that are popping Achilles heels when they're sprinting, pulling a hammy. And then there are those where the cells become dysfunctional. So the sugar gets into the muscle cells. The sugars are full of glycogen, but it doesn't work that well.
This is that's a great example, because I've worked with a lot of athletes. I've worked with a lot of people who may not be athletes but are athletic. And even myself, I had issues prior to going low carb, keto, carnivore. I had issues with pulled calves, pulled hamstrings, pulled groins, like injuries after injury after injury. And then the minute, like it was, I want to say it's immediate, but it probably took 3 months for those injuries to heal. And it's been over 4 years. I haven't had another one since I cut out carbs. So body composition is similar and has been the same. It's not about the body composition, but I tell people all the time that becoming fat adapted has reduced the inflammation, reduced the oxidative stress, reduced all the extra things my body's doing and having to manage. And that's where that comes from.
But I think in that one population, it's specific to the ligaments, the tendons, and the joint capsules. And that's why they get that inflammation. And as you said, once you lower that sugar toxicity level, because your body's always going to have a low blood sugar threshold. It can't function without that blood sugar. We'll talk about that in a second when it comes to athletic performance. However, if you crystallize those ligaments, those joints, they become brittle and they tear very easily, and then you're not able to repair them adequately. And that's something that we've learned from the type 1 diabetics who, for example, let's give you a common example. There's something called Peyronie's disease, which is a bent penis. What is that? What the hell has that got to do with it? Well, the penis has a lot of ligaments and fibrous structure. And when that gets heavily inundated with sugar, it distorts the ligaments and the tendons that are in there. And there's not any tendons in there, but the ligaments and the structure that holds it up. And you get all this bent out of shape. It's an obvious, people will remember that because of it's like, But the same thing happens with your shoulders, frozen shoulders, with your joints. So stretching helps, but stretching under those conditions can actually increase your tear rate. But if you don't have the inflammation, if your ligaments are nice and smooth and they well gelled up, there's good fluid around there, and they don't have those crystals building up in the tissues, the glycosylation, then you never have those injuries. And it allows you to stretch more easily. Your flexibility improves. Think about the back. The spine is a bunch of columns all held together by ligaments and muscles. Well, you cause inflammation of that. Anytime you move a little bit, now your back's out and those things go into spasm and they hurt like crazy.
Well, it's like you're turning everything into barbed wire instead of smooth wire.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And that's, it's not a difficult concept to understand, and it's so valid. And then what do? We go lie still and we don't move in bed. The right thing to do is to lower your sugar and warm those ligaments and muscles up to kind of disrupt or break those crystals that are formed. The other key thing, just while we're on this topic, so we can cover this briefly, and this is an amazing thing that I learned recently, last year, from Tim Noakes, and he's completely changed his concept. So if you're an athlete, we can talk a lot about how the muscles and everything works. Tim Noakes, his claim to fame in athletics, and this guy's nuts. He's an ultra distance athlete, has run over 70 ultra marathons. Okay.
Wow.
But what he does is while he's running, he would run with a needle. And while he was running, he would jab it into his thigh and do a biopsy of his muscles to look at the glycogen content of the muscles.
Oh my goodness.
His entire theory was that when your muscles stiffen, athletic performance was in large part tied to the glycogen stores in the muscles and then to oxygenation, the VO2 max, which as so much has been made of.
Yep.
And so he said, okay, if there's glycogen in the muscles, you're okay. As soon as you start to run out of glycogen, your muscles go into spasm, your performance falls off. And I've got a medical word that I use for that to quote Prof. Noakes. That is complete bullshit.
Okay.
That doesn't exist. Because the reality is, if your muscles ran out of glycogen, you'd go into rigor mortis. And that doesn't happen to athletes. So the muscles never run out of glycogen.
You're blowing people's minds right now.
Never run out of energy.
You're blowing people's minds right now.
I know, I understand that, and this is what Notes came onto my podcast last year and spoke about. It's on my YouTube channel.
Okay.
So what he realized is this, and you're a guy, you understand this. When you're driving in your car and you look at that gas gauge and it's starting to go close to empty, what do? We switch off the air conditioning, we switch off the radio, we open the window, we do everything to reduce our energy consumption so that we can drive that car as far as we can to get to the next gas station, because we're going to flirt with that empty sign. But we shut everything down that's consuming energy so we can still drive. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. The body does exactly the same thing. And the central this is called the central governor theory. The thing that controls the entire body is the brain. Okay. So, and the brain in most people is sugar dominant. So when you're eating a lot of sugar, the brain really gets to a point where the cells can pretty much only use sugar. So even if there's a slight drop in the supply of sugar to the brain, because you're using all that sugar up for your muscles, even just a slight drop, the brain says, whoa, I'm getting on empty here. And it starts to shut down other systems. And the biggest system, the biggest sump of energy is your muscles. So when you bonk, when you hit that wall, when you can't do that extra lift, it isn't your muscles that are failing. It's your brain that is shutting the muscles down.
Interesting.
And that is called the central governor theory. Now, here's the cool thing about being in ketosis. Because when your brain can comfortably use sugar and ketones or fat as a fuel source, it doesn't care if the blood sugar level or if the sugar supply level goes down a little bit, because you've got ketones as your backup.
Right.
Think about driving a hybrid car. Okay, your gas is getting a little lower or the electricity is getting low. Flip it over. Yeah. And so athletes who run in ketosis, athletes who perform in ketosis can break through that performance barrier because their brain doesn't necessarily shut down. It just shifts the type of fuel it's using.
That's a great way to look at it.
That is the advantage of being fat adapted and being in ketosis, because the muscles actually, the paradox is the muscles don't switch over to just using fat when you're in ketosis. They still use sugar, they still use some fat, but it's the brain that changes.
Right.
And that is a revolutionary concept. The science was done by a group of Swedish scientists, so there is validity to it. And that's going to be in this book we just talked about.
So what you're talking about, basically the whole idea, because this is huge in the bodybuilding space and in a lot of athletic spaces as well, and that is cyclic keto, where they're cycling in carbs to help. So they do what they call a carb depletion workout, where they have one workout where they just blast their body and deplete their carb stores. And then they go the next day or two and they eat extra carbs to kind of fill it back up and replenish their carb stores. And then they go about their thing, their regular routine. And they do that every 7 or 10 days or 15 days, something like that.
And what's the problem with that?
Well, it works, right?
The issue is to a certain extent, but how can you take that? What knowledge do you need to know whether it's working correctly?
Right. Exactly.
And the knowledge you need, and this is what athletes don't do. They make all these assumptions, but the regulator there is, and I mentioned this word before, it's the only important word to take away from there, is something called insulin resistance that is absolutely measurable. So if you're insulin resistant, if you've been eating a lot of carbohydrates, you don't fix insulin resistance in a day. It can take 4 to 6 months to correct. So you don't just switch from using one fuel source to another. The entire mechanism, the entire system, you have to rebuild the engine.
Yes,
and
100%.
We can measure in our office. We measure insulin resistance all the time. Once that athlete is insulin sensitive, they can then do the carbohydrate ketone shift.
Right.
But really, what you want to do is the place where I would disagree with the shift is you always want to be in ketosis, but you sometimes want to hit your body with some sugar that you could produce enough insulin to utilize. If you're already insulin resistant, you can't get that sugar into the cells. So now you're blocking fat mobilization, you're blocking ketosis. So you really want to know whether you're insulin sensitive or not as an athlete. And the holy grail is once you're insulin sensitive, then you can remain in basal ketosis and augment that with sugar. And a lot of like a guy called Robert Sykes, Keto Savage,
Mhm.
he'll do that. Zach Bitter does a form of that. He's the world record holder for the 100-mile runs. I mean, this guy's running, what is it, 6 minutes and 20 seconds a mile over
Yeah,
100
it's
miles.
crazy,
I
crazy,
can't do a
crazy stuff.
mile in under 8 minutes. So,
Right. Yeah, so this is what I talk to people about all the time. And again, I think it's very intensity and volume specific. There are a lot of people, most of the people that listen to me, who are just trying to get in shape and just try to have a better life, and they're not high performance athletes. So for most of the people I work with, the additional carbs are not even needed. Their body is running fine just on the
exactly
ketones,
right.
and it's not an issue. There are some people I personally know maybe one or two people who are working out at an intensity and a volume where they need to ingest carbs because they're reaching that governor where their body's just saying, no, I can't do it without it.
And really what it's about is how long does it take for your liver to be depleted of glycogen? Because the liver is going to feed that system. That's where you control.
I was going to say, is that the mechanism? Is that the governor theory? It's where your brain is saying your liver is getting run. So it's not muscle, it's liver glycogen.
Right. The liver is continuously supplying glycogen to the body. The muscles already have a store of glycogen. So it's distributed everywhere. And the liver is predominantly responsible for supplying that sugar to the brain. Now, if the brain is sugar dominant, it can only get sugar from the liver between meals. However, if it's using fat and sugar, the liver sugar lasts a lot longer. So your performance endurance is much longer just by being fat adapted without taking that extra sugar. However, you're absolutely correct. Once the liver starts getting depleted, and it's the liver is also where you produce your ketones. So it's not just ketones, it's also fat. So it's, everyone thinks ketones, but for example, if you look at the heart, let's look at the heart function. 85% of the energy used by the heart is actually long chain fatty acids called non-esterified fatty acids. And then the rest is made up of lactate, of protein, and of sugar. And a very small percentage is ketones. But while the percentage of ketones that the heart can use is small, whether it's on or off makes a massive difference to all the other energy systems. And the heart is the one muscle that's always functioning at a higher or lower rate. So the majority of energy that we use is actually non-esterified fatty acids. But then it's that slight variation that makes all the difference. Those are all things we're starting to understand now about athletes. So if you're fat adapted, insulin sensitive, you can use both fuel sources. And there's a rate limiting step to ketones and fat, but the sugar you can then add in when you need it. Some people need that extra burst of sugar if you're insulin resistant at a much, much earlier state of training. They bonk early. Whereas other folks, when they're fat adapted, can go a very long time before they need that added sugar. For a lot of us, within the time span of a workout, in other words, as you said, we don't need it because the workout is shorter than what we actually need.
Yeah, this is interesting because now we're talking about traditional conversations that talk about this stuff are really talking about metabolic pathways and how our body's processing fuel. But what you're saying, and this is, it's going to take me some, I'm going to have to listen to this talk again and try to put things together. But what you're saying is that it's really about how well the brain adapts more than it is how much your metabolism adapts.
Exactly right. So the brain causes that shutdown. However, the other thing is important is your insulin status. So for example, if you're working out between meals, and most of us don't feed right before meals, sometimes do it afterwards, then your insulin level, if you're insulin sensitive, your insulin level is low. So insulin blocks the fat cells from releasing fat. So if your insulin is low, you can pour that fat out of the fat cells. So you can provide that fat to your heart, you can provide that fat to your brain, you can provide that fat to your muscles. And also you're providing fat to the liver, and under the influence of glycogen, which is the opposite hormone, you're producing those ketones. Ideal state. Then you probably don't need a huge amount of sugar, if at all. Now, if you're running an ultra marathon or you're going to train for 3 hours, sure, have your sugar. But when you've got access to fat in a low insulin state, you really don't need an extra supply of energy. Your insulin level's up. Now you're blocking fat mobilization. So now you've switched on. You have to just be using sugar.
So, okay. So you talked about this real quick, if you wouldn't mind. I just listened to someone else's, had a video earlier that came out yesterday, a couple of days ago, talking about carbs and exercise. And one of the things that was stated in there, which I haven't really heard, he made reference to the idea that carbs are the preferred fuel for all physical activity. And I'm not sure I buy into that. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, my favorite medical word applies to that statement.
Okay.
Which is BS.
Yeah.
Absolutely not true. Human beings are fat adapted and ketone based people. So it's not about preference. Each fuel source has a different. I'll give you an example. So this is where a simple statement like that on a podcast or on the internet is just too naive.
Mm-hmm.
Your red blood cells, which carry oxygen, can only use sugar. Your heart prefers fat. So it's organ specific. Your brain prefers fat.
Right.
Your muscle cells prefer glycogen, but can also use fat. So it really depends on, and you can't just isolate this to muscles because it's all one unit. You have to have oxygen supply. So if your red blood cells have adequate glycogen, they can remove and deliver that oxygen very easily, and your muscles can benefit from whatever fuel source they're burning. Mm-hmm. The heart mostly uses fat. Under exercise and resting conditions, the brain preferentially uses ketones and fat. So that is a naive statement based on a lack of scientific knowledge about how the body works. So what they've done is they focused only maybe on some skeletal muscle, but that's not the way the body works.
Okay.
Every organ is involved, or most organs are involved.
Right.
And you just can't make such a simplistic statement. So therefore, it's completely false.
Okay. Awesome.
And actually, quite frankly, the best option is to have availability of all fuel sources. So here's the other shift. The other way you can look at it is a healthy human body, when you're eating, is anabolic. Now, what does anabolic mean? You're releasing insulin, you're releasing human growth hormone, T3, and some of the somatomedins, which allow you to store glycogen in the muscles, fat in the fat cells. During a meal, you're storing, you're distributing, you're providing fuel in different centers to the body, but it's a terrible time to exercise because you're storing, you're not able to utilize those stores. Then between meals, in a healthy person, insulin goes down once you've distributed everything as your blood sugar comes down, and now glycogen comes up. What does glycogen do? Glycogen allows the release of fat from your fat cells, which is, so don't worry about your LDL and your cholesterol. Glycogen produces ketones. Insulin blocks ketone production. Glycogen releases sugar from the liver. Glycogen turns protein into sugar. So the best time to exercise is under glycogen dominance.
You mean glucagon?
Sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry.
No, you're good. We're good.
Glucagon. Glycogen is the concentrated sugar that gets stored. Yeah. Glucagon is the hormone. I'm sorry. Thanks for the correction.
Yeah.
So glucagon, under the influence of glucagon, is the best time to exercise.
Right.
Because you don't need to eat. Your insulin has distributed that. Now your insulin's down, your glucagon's up, your cortisol is up. What do you need when you exercise? You need cortisol, you need adrenaline. Those are all your catabolic hormones or your breakdown hormones. Now, everyone thinks when I say breakdown, you're destroying tissue. No, you're not. You're breaking down the stores. Yeah. You're using glycogen, you're using fat, you're using ketones, you're producing them. And a lot of athletes, that's why when people ask me, should I eat before or after a workout? Always after. Always after, not before, because if you go and eat and exercise, now your insulin's high, you're blocking the utilization of the energy. Your body's trying to store energy. It's not liberating it for use. So it's the understanding how biology works. But in order to do that, you have to be insulin sensitive. Because if your insulin is elevated during fasting, you're blocking the use or the release. You're blocking the glucagon effect.
Right.
And restoring insulin sensitivity is crucial in a healthy athlete.
Let me ask you another question. So this is something else that you mentioned earlier, is that if we depleted our glycogen stores in our muscles, then we would basically die. Our muscles would seize up. Our muscles couldn't do anything, right? Yeah. We would seize up. So how does that go into, because one of the things that I talk about in many cases is the idea that we have enough glycogen stored in our body that even if we didn't eat any carbs for a week, 0 carbs for a week, I've got enough in my body that I could do multiple workouts in a week and still perform. My muscles have it in there. Gluconeogenesis is going to replenish it.
For 15 or 20 years.
Yeah.
Don't talk about weeks that live a life without, because the human body, when it's insulin sensitive, is so good. So let's return back to this thought. This is where it's coming from.
Yeah.
You have to have sugar in your bloodstream. You have to replenish those stores. Those stores get replenished under the influence of insulin. So what happens, and this is an important concept that a lot of athletes don't understand. everybody, and nobody really knows exactly where this threshold is. So when anybody tells you how much protein to eat, they know nothing about human biology.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that your body can handle 150 grams of protein at a meal under the influence of insulin, and you eat 300 gram steak. Okay. Now the body will take those 150 grams of that protein, break it down to amino acids, and the liver will rebuild that into proteins and ship those around the body, including your muscles.
Yeah.
And the muscles will replenish their protein. You grow a little bit, but the extra 150 that you ate supersedes the capacity of the liver to turn the amino acids into protein. Where do you store protein in the human body? You don't. There's no store for protein.
Mm-hmm.
So then that extra protein, under the influence of insulin, gets turned into sugar by the liver. The sugar goes out, replenishes some of the glycogen, and when those stores are full, that sugar comes back to the liver. The liver turns it into triglycerides, and you store it as fat. So everyone thinks, oh, I'm going to eat this big 300-gram steak and build up my muscles. Well, there's a threshold. But if you do this, if you take that same 300-gram steak, you cut it in half, you eat one for lunch and one for dinner, and your threshold is 150, all of that is going to go to muscle building.
Okay.
You see that?
Yeah.
So you can take the same steak in a 24-hour period, the same protein, and handle it differently based upon overriding the maximum capacity of your liver to handle that protein.
Yeah. Okay. And I think there's a couple points there. One is the time of digestion and working that through. A lot of people don't think about, well, let's say it takes X amount of time to get from your mouth into your small intestine, but it's going to be in there for 6-8 hours while it's digesting. So, and the rate, depending on who you talk to, the rate of digestion or the rate of absorption is 20 to 60 grams an hour. So, and it's something to play around with. So there definitely is that time frame. If you're eating, like I said, 300, that's a good example, 300 grams in a meal, that's probably too much. I will say that
remember, you need insulin to make protein in the liver. Once your insulin levels start going down, even though you're still absorbing that stuff, now you don't have that pathway open. That pathway shuts down. So
when does that? So is that part of the reason though? So my understanding is that protein is a phase 2 insulin response, which is slower and longer. Is that, I guess, for lack of a better word, designed because the digestion process takes longer? So it kind of keeps that insulin up a little bit.
Yeah, that is so important to understand, because this is what we've learned in the last probably 2 to 5, maybe 10 years, is that the common thought was that insulin gets released in response to blood sugar, because as your blood sugar goes up, your insulin goes up.
Yeah.
That is a false premise. And what you're talking about now is highly sophisticated stuff. So I don't want to lose the audience. But so, for example, I'll give you an example. If you inject you inject glucose into your bloodstream, you get a minor little bump of insulin, but you don't get that secondary big bump. So elevated blood sugar per se does not trigger major insulin release. That is a false assumption that we've made forever. If you think about insulin release, it looks like a penny farthing. The penny farthing bicycles with a little
the big wheel.
Right.
Yeah.
Glucose stimulates a little bit of a release, and then the bigger release comes from a hormone called GLP-1. Okay, GLP-1 has 2 areas of release. The first area of release in the stomach and the duodenum, which is an instant early release in response to sugar. The delayed response, the lower intestine response, is what you're talking about, where protein that is now being digested by this. Human beings have the longest small intestine in the whole of all mammals. The latter part of the intestine, when these amino acids are being absorbed, they need insulin to become protein. That insulin bump is coming from that. However, when you're eating your meat, you actually need fat with your protein, which is an interesting because we tried this experiment. We did an experiment where we believed, this is prior to that understanding I've just articulated, we believed that an elevation in blood sugar triggers insulin release. And one of the things that will, as I just explained, trigger or cause a rise in sugar is lean muscle, lean protein. So if you eat a massive amount of lean protein, we know that 2 or 3 or 4 hours later, your blood sugar will go up.
Interesting.
But what was interesting, when we measured insulin didn't budge. And the reason for that is because that GLP-1 wasn't being triggered adequately to create the big wheel insulin response.
Wow.
So
okay.
What our patients found is they were desperately hungry. They felt like crap. But as soon as they added fat into their protein, now they're happy again. So when you're eating protein, it should always be with fat. And one of the things that we found
awesome.
is, I mean, it's all just, so if you look at these athletes who are drinking protein shakes, which are pure amino acids, there's two problems with that. Number one, in order for the liver or the muscles to generate protein, you pretty much need all 21 amino acids. Some of those are very difficult to get in solution. So basically what you're drinking is a sugar drink, because the liver will turn that into sugar because all the amino acids are not representative. The second thing is the lack of fat causes major problems.
That's interesting. So is it, do we know what the mechanism, so this is totally amazing stuff. Right. I've never heard the need to combine fat and protein for that insulin response. And I think that's huge for a lot of people, because I do know there are people that are going high protein right now. The war between high fat and high protein is on right now. And
exactly.
I'm trying to get people to understand that you need adequate fat and you need adequate protein. The relationship to each other in ratio and percentages is ridiculous. Stop worrying about it. Give your body what it needs. But it's very interesting because I do know that there are people who are doing high protein and they're having those exact things. They're hungry, they're eating, and they seem like they have to eat more and more.
Correct.
And more.
They're eating all the time. They're eating multiple meals. They're not getting into that ebb and flow. So we did that with over 1,000 patients. I mean, the process of trying to write that up, and the experiment failed absolutely. I don't know if you remember on the when we were on the cruise, I had one of my patients who actually flew over from Italy. And we talked about that. She was one of the people that did that protein experiment, because what we had is the group of my patients that are so fat adapted, they become insulin suppressed. So they're not even producing insulin. So what we have to do is get them to trigger some insulin. And we thought, okay, if lean muscle can do that by turning into sugar, let's leverage blood sugar to trigger insulin. And we found the insulin curve was flat. So she was one of those people that stood up and said, I felt terrible. I went back to eating fat and I was fine.
So do we know how much fat, or is the way
I look at it,
what the mechanism is?
Yeah, I don't know what the quantification is. What I tell people is just eat the fat that comes with the food.
Exactly.
So the skin on the 100%. Chicken, the ribeye steak. Yep. There's this whole concept of 80-20 now, and that really is to drive fat adaptation and fat ketosis. It's a different principle. The 80-20 is the eye of the needle. It suppresses appetite. It helps you get back on track on a ketogenic or a carnivore diet, but it's not necessarily, the 80-20 split is not necessarily good for athletes. So I'll tell them, eat what you need. One of the other things that we do use a fair amount, and I know you're going to have, oh no, I can't do that. One of the healthiest, most comprehensive foods that we use in what I call the growth space, and most athletes are, for the most part, trying to grow, either by endurance or by size. What is the most important growth factor that all mammals absolutely require?
The most important?
The most, without which mammals could not exist.
That's a good question. I don't know. I got a couple of ideas. I mean, are we talking a hormone or like testosterone or
no? Substance, food substance.
Oh, protein. No.
Well, it's broader than that.
Broader than
It's simple. Milk.
Interesting. Okay.
All mammals produce milk, and no mammal, except for humans who've now concocted this formula, can survive without milk. Think about that. That's logic. You don't have to be a scientist.
Okay.
So milk is one of the most powerful growth hormones, because who gets milk? Growing babies.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. And these babies are doubling their body size on a regular basis. So there's massive growth potential, and milk contains everything a baby needs to grow. Whether you're a platypus or an antelope or a lion or a human, that's all we need. So it's got the growth hormones in it, it's got the sugar in it, and it's got the protein and fat in it in all the right ratio. And if ever you looked at raw milk, cow's milk, you see this massive amount of fat, but tons of protein in it.
Right.
It's also got all the hormones for growth. So in my obese patients, in my recovering diabetics, I try not to use dairy products, certainly not drinking milk. But a lot of my athletes can drink that milk. The other benefit of the milk, it is the only product that does not have fructose in it as a sugar. Now, malt sugar can be glucose, but almost all the sugar that we consume, all the carbohydrates we consume, is a combination of glucose and fructose.
Right.
Okay.
And we know fructose is
right. Milk is glucose and galactose. because fructose does not have a powerful insulin response.
So what do you say to the camp of people? Because there's a lot of people that are saying, no mammals as adults drink milk. It's only for babies.
That is absolutely correct. But no mammals are trying to grow as adults. Okay.
Interesting.
Your lion isn't out behind the second bush on the left on the veld doing push-ups with doing.
So you're talking specifically if this is a sports performance type of a thing, not in general health.
Growth and athletic performance and recovery, and also that little bit of sugar in the milk has a powerful insulin response.
Right.
And I leverage milk in someone who can afford to gain a couple of pounds or wants to bulk up a little bit, or is an athlete that's going to burn out those calories. And I hate that phrase, but that's where milk products are useful, probably better than a lot of these factory-made protein shakes.
Interesting.
And if you can access raw milk, which we fortunately have an access to, that for me is one of the healthiest things that you can do. Now, obviously, we're not, you can argue we're not cows or whatever it is, but that mixture, you can't do better than that. And I know that there's arguments, pros and cons, but athletes are able to use milk. And, there's two parts to this. If you haven't had milk for a long time, of course, your gut's going to be terrible because the enzymes that break it down are missing. You've got to re-recruit those. That may take a month or two. And yes, there are some milk allergies, but the allergies are to the protein, not to the sugar in milk.
Okay.
So lactose allergy is rare. So again, these are all things that are logical, and then from a science perspective have validity.
Yeah, this is all fantastic stuff. I think the one thing I do want to kind of go back to a little bit, because I'm curious to see what your thoughts are, is what do you think is answer this one or two ways. What do you think is a good amount of protein someone should be getting, or how does someone find out what that amount is?
Right. If anybody ever tells you they know nothing about nutrition.
Yeah.
So I don't know the answer, but your body does. Okay.
Bingo.
If you are really, and it really depends on who you are. I'm going to make an assumption that you are an athlete who doesn't mind gaining 1 or 2 pounds. And I literally mean 1 or 2 pounds. If you're trying to lose weight, this doesn't apply. If you're trying to get healthy, this doesn't apply. But eat as much meat as you want to, with protein and fat. So let me ask you this question. When you're really hungry, or let's say it's your meal time, and I put an 84-ounce ribeye steak in front of you, how much can you eat?
If I just an 84-ounce, wow. I could probably eat like 24 to 32 ounces at once. Here's the thing,
Bronson, you have no idea. You have no idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
your body knows exactly. So as you're eating, you might eat 12 ounces, you might eat 20 ounces, but it
could be different based on the day.
Right. There's 4 hormones. There's GIP, there's GLP-1, there's peptide YY, there's leptin, all of those hormones. And that's why the fat is so important, because fat triggers these hormones. Those hormones go back to your brain and say, dude, you're finished. And even if you've got this great, juicy, free Wagyu steak in front of you that's 84 ounces, there's no way you can eat more. 5 minutes later, you're not sitting in front of the TV snacking on more steak, okay? Because you're full. But you are sitting there snacking on some ice cream or some pretzels. Because there is no restriction, biologic restriction for carbohydrate consumption. There is very tight control, very tight restriction for protein and fat, a combined protein and fat consumption. And the soluble fat is a very powerful satiety hormone, or triggers the satiety hormones. So your GIP, your GLP-1, your peptide YY, your leptin, there's one other one, DPP-4, those are your satiety hormones, and they get triggered sequentially in your gut by saturated fat.
Okay, so this is different than what I've heard for years. And depending on who you talk to, I think half of the people I talk to are going to say fat is satiating. Half the people you talk to say protein is satiating. What I'm kind of coming to the understanding of that it's not one or the other, but it's both of them in combination.
The combination is important. The fat will do that. The reason why, for example, I put a little bit of heavy whipping cream in my coffee is because I haven't eaten yet today.
Yeah.
But if you look at one of the leaders in the carnivore movement, who's a power lifter, a power athlete, Sean Baker, Sean will eat tons of meat, but he knows where that limit is. And your body knows exactly where that limit is for meat, whether it's chicken with a skin on, whether it's a steak. But if you eat that lean chicken, you're going to get hungry 10 minutes later. We know that lean protein does not cause satiety. And I will say that categorically because I have over 1,000 patients, as I said, that I'm busy writing up right now, where that experiment failed. They get hungry, they're miserable,
Yeah.
they have to eat again. That fat is necessary,
Okay.
and especially in fat-adapted athletes. So the fat that comes with the food is ideal. When you add it in or use what's in there, it's perfect.
Is there are we any closer to understanding what the mechanism behind that is?
It's GLP-1 release.
It's okay. And that's
GLP-1.
triggered by fat.
Correct. And I'll give you an example of how this works. GLP-1 is very commonly used now, black marketed and prescribed for weight loss and for the treatment of type 2 diabetes, because really GLP-1 is a hormone that controls or corrects insulin resistance, which again is my watchword for the day. And it has multiple functions. One of the functions is to release insulin, trigger insulin release. One function is to block glucagon or the release of sugar. And it also has a very powerful central satiety effect. So I'll give you a personal example. I used it for a couple of weeks to experiment with it. And I can usually eat anywhere from about 10 to 15 chicken wings at a sitting, and then I'm stuffed. And chicken wings have skin on them. I add salt to them. They've got the ideal protein-fat ratio, okay? When I was on a GLP-1 agonist, I used Ozempic because it was the one I had access to. I ate 3 chicken wings, I was done. So it's the activation by fat of GLP-1 that triggers satiety. So we know more than we think we know.
Interesting.
And that's why that combination of protein and fat, and what I teach my patients to do, forget about artificial hormones, is to add a little bit of soluble fat to their food. So when you're eating the ribeye steak and you're trying to lose weight, eat that fatty part first, or put a little bit of butter on it and eat that soluble fat first. Why? Because the soluble fat goes through your gut much quicker. And it's when that soluble fat triggers that GLP-1 that you're going to get that satiety response. And then the second wave of GLP-1 3 or 4 hours later in the lower intestine is what results in the insulin allowing that protein to be used or converted to sugar.
Okay. Interesting.
That's why we see the late conversion. Does it make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
And we're just starting to unravel these dynamics. And the beauty for me is I see thousands of patients. I have blood work on every one of them. I measure insulin, I measure glucagon, I measure C-peptide, I measure lipids on every single patient. And it starts to tell a story. So what I'm telling you now, some of it is known, some of it is so obvious in the blood work that we see and reports from these patients. And I freely admit that I failed in that experiment to try to trigger insulin through lean protein. So I would tell you categorically that lean protein over time triggers hunger, not satiety.
And that's blowing you're blowing minds right now. My mind is a little blown, and you're leading me into some rabbit holes. I'm going to spend probably the next 2 months looking up GLP-1 and doing all this other kind of research, because
it really is. I'm not a big fan of kind of miracle drugs, but when we discovered insulin in 1910, it was this miracle cure for diabetes. And for 100 years now, 110 years, we've focused on insulin as the dominant hormone because of the diabetes but what we now have realized over the last decade or two is GLP-1 is actually the quarterback. Insulin is kind of the running back, at least when it comes to energy. Now, if you do something simple, you don't have to be a scientist to do it. Go to Wikipedia and Google insulin, and you go down to functions of insulin. You'll find one of it is to regulate energy. But insulin is actually a massive hormone that controls DNA. So it controls DNA replication, it controls cell division, cell growth. Insulin is probably a more powerful growth hormone than human growth hormone.
Wow. Okay.
We know HGH because of muscular growth.
Right.
But all the other cells that are turning over, your skin that's turning over, all the tissues, that turnover is a big deal. And when you are insulin resistant, that's when bad things start to happen at a cellular level. So, for example, if we see Jamie Seaman told me this fact. She's a gynecologist who does the Hard to Kill Summit in Omaha, Nebraska. And one of her slides showed that the incidence of breast cancer has gone up by 256% because of insulin resistance that no longer blocks that genetic division, and these cells just divide like crazy. That's why the cancer risk of hyperglycemia is so high. Prostate cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, pancreatic cancer is going through the roof because of insulin resistance. So insulin has a lot of other quarterback functions. HGH helps mostly with the muscle growth, but all the other cells that need insulin from time to time. But if insulin levels are up all the time, that is an unregulated system. Okay. So, when we start to talk about disease, hyperinsulinemia is a very important problem when it comes to so many other diseases.
Yeah, you're giving me information, and everybody that's going to be listening to this is going to be like, what do I even do with this? I've been much more, when I first got into Carnivore, when I first started doing this, I was realizing the importance of protein, and I talked a lot about people need to increase their protein. And lately, the past couple of months, I've been really trying to get people to understand that, yes, while we need to prioritize protein, like I said, we need to understand that fat and protein are individual knobs, and they need to be adjusted as your body needs them.
One of the things that I've stopped doing is using the word protein. I use the word meat.
Okay.
And meat from natural sources pretty much has, when you harvest meat, it usually has a combination of fat and protein.
Sure.
And yeah, you can get a deer meat, which is fairly lean. But even if you look, even I didn't know this, but if you look at a white chicken breast and you analyze the fat, there's about 8 to 10% of that lean chicken breast is actually fat. Right. Now, you want the skin, but there is fat in all meat. And I think I prefer to use the word meat or fish, or, in other words, the whole animal.
Okay.
Rather than divide it up into protein and fat. And I think if you think about it in this country, this is one of the few countries in the world where we slaughter an animal and cut the fat away because it's bad for us. It was interesting in the COVID when
they didn't used to do that. They used to do it with all the
But even milk, they scrape off the fat. So even whole milk is fat reduced milk.
Yeah.
And it's just it's so frustrating when you wrap your head around the fact that fat is necessary, sugar isn't.
Right.
Because so here's another interesting thing that Zoe Harcum talks about a lot, is that you asked me about protein needs. The amount of protein in most diets is relatively fixed between 20 and 25%. Most people don't eat less than 18 to 20% of protein, and very few people eat above 25% of their calories as protein. So really the variables are the percentage of fat and the percentage of carbohydrates that we eat. Those are the two things that vary. And Gary Taubes talks about this as well. And what we've done as a society over the last 70 years is shifted to 55 to 80% of those extra calories come in the form of sugar, when that should mostly be fat. So that's where the 80-20 comes in, that's becoming popular in the protein. But that around 20% of your meal is almost always the percentage of protein in meals. Whether the rest is made up by carbs or fat, you can intentionally shift that around. But that is typically the number that we use. I don't want to talk about grams, but that ratio is about correct. So that's where the 18-20 movement comes from.
I usually find for most people who are trying to improve lean mass and physical activity that they need to be 25, 30, maybe even 35%. But
right, and I would
it tends to be low.
Probably a little bit excessive. In other words, the body can't handle that percentage of lean protein, so it converts the rest to sugar.
So that was another thing I want to talk about. So the idea of protein being turned to sugar, I think the threshold of what that protein amount is higher than most people think. I think a lot of people have been brainwashed to think that they need this little amount, and you can actually have more. But then the idea that it's automatically turned to sugar, I think, is novel to most people. My understanding has always been that your body's going to use it or get rid of it. So
there's no store for amino acids in the human body. We can store sugar, we can store fat. There is no store for amino acids. So it has to be built into protein. And there's a rate limiting step to protein synthesis controlled by insulin. So as your insulin levels come down, now you got glucagon, and glucagon's job, and the reason we don't need to eat sugar, glucagon's job is to turn protein into sugar and then fat. So if you look at some of my pure carnivores who are heavily fat adapted, the insulin levels are low. You look at their triglycerides, they start to go up. Their blood sugars start to go up. Their A1C start to go up, but they're eating no sugar. They're just eating protein, and they're eating a ton of protein and not very athletic. And that is because the protein is being turned to sugar. That's one of the reasons why a guy like Paul Saladino will add some carbs back. Now, Paul is way over the top, but we actually intentionally add some carbohydrates back, not because carbohydrates are important, but GLP-1 and insulin is. And so if you drink your milk, it triggers GLP-1 and insulin, which then protects that protein from becoming too much sugar.
Now, question is there, when you're doing that, when you're looking at these people, are you looking at their total intake? Are they eating enough?
They're eating more than what they need.
Okay, from a fat and a protein perspective.
From a total global caloric. And the problem is not just that they eat too much. That's too simplistic. They eat too much at any one time. Because what happens with a lot of these fat-adapted carnivores, they're just not hungry, so they're eating once a day. But they're eating a massive amount once a day. And one of the things we do for some of those lean mass hyper responders is we break that same amount in to 3 meals a day or 2 meals a day. Now that you're not meeting that threshold, that was the difference in that 300-gram steak versus 2 150s.
Right.
Is your body can handle that. And really, it comes down to insulin and glucagon. And if your insulin, these patients, when you measure them, their insulin, they don't produce an insulin response. They're flat. And that's why we need that sugar to trigger that GLP-1. Even with the fact that they're eating, they're not getting an insulin release response beyond the liver. So their blood sugars are actually going up and their A1Cs are going up. How can that be? Carnivore is supposed to be so good.
So I've heard a couple of people talk about the A1C on carnivore, and the current theory that I've heard professed. I know Dr. Bickman and some other people.
That's gonna be a bullshit argument. Red blood cells live a longer period of time.
Right.
Okay. So let's take that. The problem is no one number tells a story.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's assume you're correct. How does that cause your triglycerides to go up? How does that cause your uric acid to go up? How does that cause your average blood sugar to go up? Absolute BS. And Paul Mason is the first guy that put that story. And Paul's a good friend of mine. I love Paul, one of the most brilliant guys out there, but absolutely wrong. We know that if you shorten the lifespan of your red blood cells, your A1C goes down. But
So,
even if your A1C is up, you got to look at the other numbers. And all of these people, when their A1C goes up, their triglycerides go up, their HDL comes down, their blood sugar's up, their uric acid is up, their BUN goes super high.
Yeah.
BUN is the waste product when you're turning protein to sugar. So a BUN above 22 is problematic.
Okay. So I've been carnivore for over 4 years. My numbers all look good. The only thing that I've seen an increase in, and I think it's because recently I've specifically been experimenting with high protein, is some of my kidney numbers have gone up. Outside of that, my A1C
are some of the important ones. The creatinine, the uric acid, and the BUN. Creatinine should be below 1, ideally around 0.7. If that starts to creep up, that is the breakdown of that protein towards sugar. But why are your numbers as good as they are?
Because I'm active, because I have a lot of muscle.
Thank you.
Right.
Because you're using it.
So that goes into my next question, and that is, I'm wondering if what we're coming up against here is our biological need that is based on our history as human beings versus our state as a modern person.
Absolutely, no question.
And how that ties in.
What you've got to remember is that you're a little bit out there in terms of a gym rat. But,
a little bit.
but I mean, if you go overseas, and I've just come back from a lecture tour in Europe.
Yeah.
Those people may not be athletes, but they're walking everywhere. They're climbing stairs because often these houses don't have elevators. We have become so damn sedentary in this country that, people will get in their car to go 100 yards down to the store to go and buy, their M&Ms and drive back.
Right.
The Europeans are much more mobile. The Africans are even more mobile than we are. These guys will walk 3 to 5 miles to go and get some water. So we've got to look at, I don't use the word exercise, I use the word physical activity. And it's not the intensity, it's the frequency.
Yes.
And from a mental health perspective, we haven't even touched that. Physical activity is one of the most profoundly positive mental health issues.
Yes.
Mental health offsetter. It's one of the most healthy endorphin activities you can do.
Right.
But also it changes your entire energy spend.
Energy spend and requirement for nutrients, right? So
Everything.
just like the more muscle mass you have, the more glycogen you can store. The more physically active you are, the more you're making your body work, the more protein you can tolerate, the more fuel you can tolerate. Like everything gets better. So if whatever you're having, if you're using your body, it kind of brings the whole package together and makes it all work better.
Exactly right. And I think whether in this country we have to go to the gym because we're bumps on a log for the rest of the day. I've been sitting in this chair since 7 o'clock this morning, but I exercised early this morning. I'll do it again this evening. And exercise may be too strong for me, but I'm physically active because that has to be intentional because my body needs that.
Yeah.
And when I'm not doing that, my ligaments are tightening up, I'm stiffening up, and I just don't feel so good. So because those little dynamics shift, and you're overloading the system in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
So everything about the human body is ebb and flow, load and unload. And when you skew that one way or the other way, that can be problematic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Fantastic.
I think the role of physical activity on a regular basis is enormous and completely under-measured and underscored in this country.
100%. 100%. I very much try to, you've heard my talk, you've heard me explain to people that, I think nutrition helps handle internal stress and helps us manage the things inside our body, but then all of the external things in our physical capability is where the external, but the two of them interplay with each other. If we don't use our body, it's like who cares what kind of fuel you put in your car if you never get a tune-up, if you never change your tires, if you never go out and drive it.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So no, I think that ebb and flow is so important, but that's just the physical part. The mental health part is so incredible. The cool thing for me when I'm on my walks or on my runs or whatever physical activity I'm doing, the world can dissolve around me.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes irrelevant because I lock in to my subconscious, and in that relaxed state, I'm able to process tough emotional issues that I'm not able to do in the stress of the day. So we unpack what I call psychological hoarding when you give yourself moments of physical activity, and it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter how long or how far or how fast. What matters is the act. Because again, like eating a steak, your body knows. There are days when a 5-minute walk is adequate. There are days when I need an hour-long walk. And quite frankly, I will take a 5-minute walk on a crappy day. That's far more beneficial to me than an hour-long walk on an easy day.
Yeah.
Because when my brain is stressed out, I need to relax my body and my brain.
Yeah.
And a walk is much better than a bag of M&Ms.
Yeah, that for sure. So we're going to have to do a second one because I've got a whole bunch of stuff.
I told you we weren't even get past the introduction. But, one of the things, Bronson, is that this conversation, because we're talking about athleticism, not just obesity and diabetes and all the other illnesses, we're not talking about illnesses. We're talking about wellness and optimization.
Yes.
And that's a whole different discussion. And really understanding the energy hormonal interaction. And I think a lot of athletes ignore the hormones that regulate energy direction.
Mm-hmm.
And what I try to do is present the complexity of that. And it's not just as simple as saying sugar is the body's fuel. Right.
Not at all. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Cywes. I appreciate it. We definitely need to do a part 2 because there's a whole side to the mindset aspect and the addiction and breaking cycles and that whole piece of the puzzle that I want to talk about. So we'll definitely have you back on sometime soon.
And the other part also is athletes may be the healthiest people while they're athletically performing, but they also become some of the unhealthiest people out there because of what they ate when they performed.
Yeah.
So we deal with that a lot, and I think that's the heart attack that you have at 50, all those things. Those are going to be important for us, I believe, to discuss in the next part. So happy to do so.
Awesome. Thank you very much for being on. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Where can people find you? I know you're on Instagram.
My tag is Carb Addiction Doc, and I've got a YouTube channel that is right now just about to hit 100,000 viewers.
Woo.
I've got a Instagram. I'm on TikTok and I'm on Facebook. I don't interact that much on those, but because I'm a clinically practicing doctor, if you want to get blood work, if you want to have this conversation in a personal way, set up a visit with us, a consultation, 561-517-0642, all over the world. So we use WhatsApp, it's +1. That's the way you access me in the office to set up a visit, a consultation. We take insurance, we do self-pay. And even if you're an athlete and you just want to know what your blood work levels are, if nobody's ever looked at an insulin or a C-peptide and you want to hear my take on that coordination, or if somebody says, well, you've got to be on a statin because your LDL is too high, we can break that down for you if you're interested. So that's really my wheelhouse, is one-to-one clinical discussion based on blood work as an individual.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.